to be talking about a pretty big milestone in anatomy that we hit today in our first year of med school. And this was actually physically removing a brain from the skull of our cadaver. And so I'm going to talk about this. So yeah, it's probably going to be graphic. I'm not going to show anything. There's not going to be any names, but it's just going to be reflecting a bit on the experience, because I think it's pretty, from a high level, kind of philosophically, it's very interesting to know that like you're holding what makes humans humans, and it's like one human holding another human's brain. There's a lot of I don't know, just from a different perspective, I think it's pretty incredible that you know, I had the chance to even do that today. And you know, again, just kind of reiterating what so much of the faculty says and what the students feel is that for being a medical student, or you know, people who are pursuing their physical therapy degrees, or you know, their DPM, or nurses, like having this experience of being able to dissect a cadaver and get to this level is something that's really special and makes the experience different from a lot of other fields. And so the people who, and the families who donate their bodies for this, are providing an amazing gift to a bunch of people that help us become better healthcare professionals at the end of the day. So it's a huge thank you. I would like to thank all those people who do that. And yeah, the actual process of separating the brain from the skull started with basically removing the scalp, which was just a bunch of skin and some connective tissue. And then we didn't do this part, but they have one of their faculty members comes around and uses basically a saw, like a little circular saw thing, and just comes around just like a Dremel, basically cuts a line around the head, just kind of like a crown, and then near the base of the skull they do a wedge cut. And so after they cut through, we take a wedge, literally just it's like a metal flat, like a, you know, it's like this, you just put it into that hole, and then you twist it to kind of separate the top part of the skull from the base. And so you go around and do that, and as you're doing that, if I want to get really graphic, it makes a lot of interesting sounds, and that is the dura mater inside of that brain. So dura mater in Latin means tough mother. And so that tough mother is really clinging the skull onto that brain. It doesn't want to give up. And you know, even though these cadavers are, you know, they've been dead for a while, that dura mater still doesn't want to give up, and so separating it is tough. That's why it's the tough mother. And so just go around with this wedge, and you just keep twisting it, separating it, and it puts up a good fight. And eventually you're able to get the top part of the skull off. You see the brain, and generally what you're going to see is, it depends on the cadaver, but sometimes the dura mater will stay on the brain, and sometimes it'll stay on the skull. So in older patients, the brain, the dura mater typically stays on the actual, you know, top part of the skull that gets taken off. And then for younger patients, it's going to stay. And so the way you know is that dura mater is opaque. So I think people have a general idea of what a brain looks like. You can see all those sulci, which is those little creases that help increase surface area. And so if you can't see those, and all you see is like, you know, this like very opaque whitish thing, sometimes it's red depending on if they had any hemorrhaging, then you know that's dura mater. So once you take away the dura mater from the brain, what you end up seeing is stuff called the arachnoid layer. And the reason it's called the arachnoid layer is because it looks like spider webs. And so the arachnoid layer also creates the subarachnoid space, which is, it's I'm trying to think of analogies. It's like if you had two pieces of paper and then you just had like a few pillars between those papers, it creates empty volume between these spaces, and that's where your cerebral spinal fluid resides in your brain. And so that's another layer. And then below that layer, so you got dura mater, the arachnoid layer, the arachnoid space, and then you've got pia mater, which stands for soft mother. So you've got the soft mother, that's the one that's very warm and loving, that's actually on the brain tissue itself. And so that's the stuff that you know you're there when the brain actually starts looking shiny, and not spider webby or opaque. So that's what the top of the brain looks like, and it's still in the actual cranium. And so the faculty members are the ones who actually did this part, because first year medical students are not, they just told us, like, you know, this is a really tough one that you will mess up. And so they just said, we're going to do this. So the faculty members came around, and basically at the top of the head, so the most anterior part of the head, they stuck their fingers in. Again, that dura mater, that tough mother, was holding the rest of that brain into that cranium. So you're trying to separate those with your fingertips, and you're getting deep down in there very gently. You don't want to damage any tissues or any structures, because we're trying to preserve this stuff so we can study it. And then afterwards, you know, you eventually see two big nerves, and these are the optic nerves that lead to the eyes. And you see the optic chiasm, where those two nerves literally do this little cross thing. So you get that cross, and then these nerves go there. And you've also got your internal carotid artery, which is a huge artery that supplies a lot of the brain, also right next to the optic nerves. So those two structures need to be cut, because the optic nerves are what is also helping anchor the brain into the cranium. So you get those removed. And then the other thing that you note when you're doing this stuff is that, you know, as you lift the skull away from the brain, there's going to be a bunch of other dura mater, not just connecting the brain surface to the top of the skull, but inside the brain, there's something that's called the falx cerebri, and that's made of dura mater, and that separates the superior parts of your brain in half. And so that's how you have a left and a right cerebrum. And then you've also, so that those two lines form this is called the sagittal plane. And so you will see that sagittal dura mater come together, and it joins at this thing called the superior sagittal sinus. So that's where a lot of blood flows. And you also have, I'm sorry, I'm going into a little bit too much detail here, but within that superior sagittal sinus, it's draining all the way back to the back of your head, down to there was a name for it, and it'll come back to me later, the confluence. But basically what you have is in that arachnoid space, you're gonna have to drain that cerebral spinal fluid somewhere. And so you get these things that are called the arachnoid granules that punch through the dura mater and get to that superior sagittal sinus, and then they drain the cerebral spinal fluid into that. So these things look like, in the analogy they use in class, is cauliflower. So you see these kind of like just white dots on the brain once you've removed the top of the skull. And so that's the purpose of those things, and everyone has them because you need them, because you got to recycle your cerebral spinal fluid somehow. And so that was an important one. So getting back to kind of, you know, you're trying to lift the brain out of the actual cranium. Like, how are you going to do that? So you've just cut your optic nerves, you've cut your the internal carotid arteries on both, you know, the left and the right sides, and then finally, what needs to happen is, again, just keep pulling the brain, separating the tissue from that dura mater that's really trying to hold that thing down onto the skull. And this is the part where it gets super tricky. Is you've got your brain stem that goes through this thing called the foramen magnum, which is this literally like big hole. That's literally what it means. And it's at the base of the skull. So you've got that brainstem going down there, and ideally you cut as inferiorly as you can to preserve as many of those structures as you can, like the cerebellum and the medulla and the pons. And so basically, once you cut that, the brain just kind of lifts out. You are tearing a bunch of the cranial nerves and arteries when you do this, but those things are generally weak enough to the point where they're just going to snap pretty cleanly, so you can still identify them afterwards. But in terms of the physical structures that you are cutting to get this brain out, like that's what happens. And so, yeah, just being there and watching it was definitely an interesting experience that hopefully it's interesting for other people too. For some reason, I kept thinking about I kept thinking to myself, this is what aliens would do if we just abducted some human. We would be studying their brain like this. And I also was thinking about this thing that my biology teacher had in my high school. It was AP Bio, and I really enjoyed his class a lot. And he had a statue of this monkey that was holding the brain, and it was kind of posing like that. And I kept thinking about that in my head as we were doing this dissection. So yeah, that's kind of the fun, interesting part. The boring part comes down to the, now let's memorize and name every single last structure, vein, artery, nerve, fascia that we see here. And so now that's where, we get to go study a lot more. But the actual experience of doing this dissection and seeing it, and also being able to see the variety that exists in people, was incredible. And we had one cadaver who had a massive brain hemorrhage, and you could see how much blood was pooled up on one side of their brain. And being able to see this stuff really kind of adds context to it and makes it more than just some words a teacher says during a lecture. So it's definitely a very good experience to have, in my opinion, in terms of people who are going into healthcare, to really understand, respect, and appreciate the variety of life. And so I'm gonna wrap things up with that, but definitely a cool experience. And it's something that I feel lucky to have been able to have had. So again, thank you to the donors and their families, and I hope everyone out there is doing well. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'll talk to you guys next time.